We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Welcome to Varn Vlog Solo, and tonight I'm going to talk about the impending crises that we see everywhere, from food to production. I'm going to point out that for all the seeming black-pilledness that people think I am, I don't point to this stuff because it couldn't be another way. Like the idea that we can't even get the kinds of milquetoast reforms that you would get in social democratic countries after the profitability crisis of the 70s is interesting only in so much that you have to explain why those countries have it and the United States doesn't. Now, none of those social democracies are as generous as a lot of people portray them. There's flaws in them, but basic social infrastructure gets repaired. I walk around the city, and how many derelict buildings do you see in the U.S.? You walk around the city and ask yourself, when's the last time there's been a new international airport built in the United States? Even I didn't know this. My friend Keith told me today, and I checked it and I verified it, actually. The last time you saw a new international airport built, not one just kind of glommed onto and refurbished, was 1980. 42 years ago. You see, neoliberalism was a promise to move most of America out of the real economy. It wasn't a decline in the state. That's a myth, and absolutely not supported by the size of the state. No, the state has expanded during the neoliberal period. What changed was what the state was doing, what interest it was protecting, and how it was going to protect it. And then you saw this meritocracy be sold to people. Now, I'm going to be reading some books by some people who are not socialist on this problem, because I think I need to get in my head what I've missed about the educational elites and how a meritocracy functions. I started with the book Disciplined Minds. I've read Kathleen Liu's Virtue Hoarders, which I was mixed on, but Disciplined Minds got me thinking about specialization. And then I connected that to Joseph Tainter's comments about specialization and collapse. We have to ask ourselves, what produces what we see, right? Why does it seem like even the very intelligent of us act so stupid when they are clearly specialized and hyper intelligent in a field? And why does it seem like there's incentives for them not to know more than they do? Why does it seem like people will talk about the problems of testing, which are real, but then ignore all other social inputs about literacy as if they don't matter? Why will people frame this as an ideological debate, either in, how mathing hurts the disadvantage, or how math and science testing hurts the disadvantage in particular, or in parental choice and protecting your kids from the test? Because while I'm not actually a proponent of these standardized tests, now we have nothing to judge on. And one thing I've noticed was a two-tiered system in a lot of schools. While tracking and all that has formerly been done away with in most schools, detracking has had very little effect in aggregate on success. It's not been shown to help or hurt. The assumptions, based off of early research in the 70s, was that detracking would lead to the exposure of disadvantaged students to the kinds of social norms and skills that the more intelligent and usually higher social economic people were segregated from in tracking. All right, so if you get rid of that, it will go away. Well, it just hasn't had that much effect at all. And what you've had is de jure tracking become de facto tracking. So IB programs become volunteer, honors programs become opt-into, the richer families know to opt into them. There are schools within schools and magnet programs within public schools, so schools look to be desegregated, but if you actually look at the actual classes, you don't see the same thing. This has become a way to protect a certain group of people's access to social capital, and that group of people is not particularly productive. More and more influence goes into non-productive technologies. Now, if you don't think this is relevant to things like why we aren't investing in infrastructure and why it's hard to even find people to do the work, you're missing the point. Things could be another way, but they're not another way because they're not incentivized to be. And the left, whatever you think the left, quad left is, has failed on this point. I was talking to my friends today, and I had a long conversation about this, and I had to admit that I had not taken some of these skill captured choke points that we call the professional managerial class seriously enough as something that could be generationally inherited, particularly in terms of the protections of cultural capital and wealth. You see, I often forget that I am an outlier. And my mom is an outlier. We are from the blue collar section of the working class, a very small section of the working class in the developed world now. It's only about 13% of the population, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that sector is also not a sector that's had a lot of profits been directed its way. Most the percentage of GDP that goes into financial overhead went from about 4% in the 1930s to about 10% now, meaning that $1 out of every $10 is lost in financial instruments. It's sucking up productive capacity. We talk about productive versus unproductive assets. This is what we mean. If you don't like me talking about fictitious capital because you think it's based on some kind of mechanistic metaphor, I'll grant you that. But we do have to look at where this is being invested and how and why there are the choke points that seemingly even popular movements cannot overcome. And don't tell me that they aren't popular, because single payer has something like 60% public support, 70% public support, depending on the area, and almost as high in red states. Many of the things that I hear people tell me that Americans believe are not things that Americans believe in poll after poll. They're things that our political class pushes and people in foreign media hear. You want to fight these people, you're going to fight tooth and nail in both parties and against both parties. And you're going to have to do things that we're currently not doing. If the social democratic left was serious, it would be doing the same things at school boards in exurban areas where social democrats live as the right has been doing, and weaponizing the same kinds of attacks, and yet it doesn't do it. The question is why? Who does that failure serve? If we're going to be materialist, we can't just look at materialism on the micro level. The macro level. We can't just look at these large movements of flows and profits and capital. We also have to ask ourselves, what are the material conditions that lead someone in an RV versus someone who is homeless versus someone who is underemployed but somehow has a place to live versus someone who has a job? Why do we have a problem with homelessness? Well, that's obvious, right? Like these investment mechanisms in housing, but that's not just been investment mechanisms for companies, my friends. And some of it was also policy choice. The Democrats under Obama threw a bone to healthcare, but didn't put any cost controls in that bone. And then allowed the Fed to use every instrument it had to make sure that fiscal capital was afloat. Because if a rotten tree falls in a forest, to quote another YouTuber, everyone beneath that tree still gets crushed. But they didn't invest that in public investment. And there would have been a time period where you could have just pumped massive money into infrastructure in like 2008, 2009, 2010. That was not done. And it's not being done now. Despite everyone's prediction 2 years ago that neoliberalism was dead. Neoliberalism's been dying, by the way, for 10 years. Yet some of the key traits are still with us. Now, you're seeing real shoring, you're seeing the beginnings of investments in the productive capacity because people realize that this attempt to make the real economy, the physical economy, operate like a rentier economy where you have instant production times and just-in-time placement will not work. And in the case of food, it's going to be tragic. I've talked about this on TIR, on the patrons only episodes, but just I want you to watch the problems that we're having with baby formula are likely to spread to other parts of the food production scale. The left will need to learn to eat some crow and be humble mentally, not because we're going to get any benefit from that. We don't get any social benefit from that, but to keep ourselves sane. Because we've been wrong. Even I've been wrong about who and what and how we should handle these problems. We can throw out our Marx quotes. We can talk about neo-Kautskyism. We can do strategy after strategy. We can quote this, and we can learn from these strategies. They are important, but they aren't everything. The material conditions are changing. Can we explain accurately, not just in a way that flatters our current ideological predispositions, who's in the trailer and who's not? Why did the DSA not really pick up the talking points truly of the fentanyl crisis? Were we afraid we were going to be giving too much to cops? Why did we allow defunding the police to replace prison abolition and other more serious and more radical things? Because it seemed like it was a viable strategy. Why have we let some of our best minds be pushed more and more towards the right because they told us things we didn't want to hear? And why can't we look that despite the fact that the conservatism of the elderly does not necessarily translate to the young, neither does the leftism that was assumed to be there, won't necessarily translate. Every study I say that looks at national conservatives and whatnot will comment on how young they are. And I want you to look at the Democrats in Congress, not the squad, right? Not the 6 or 7 or 10 people that we throw on every billboard and shows up on Democracy Now! To make us feel good. Look at the people who've been there no matter what, whose scandals we can't get rid of. Insider trading, Feinstein's still there, even though she goes senile in the Senate. How many DUIs does Nancy Pelosi's husband have? And I want you to also remember, for all the complaints about Pelosi, she was the AOC of the 70s and 80s. Jean Quan was a Maoist. It wasn't just that these people were recuperated. In some ways, they were recuperated from a more radical point than the point of the social democrats we are dealing with now. Now, sometimes I argue with people like Freddie DeBoer about the likelihood of social democracy to work. But we have to ask ourselves, we could be investing in more productive things, and we aren't. Even other capitalist countries can do this. Now, there's blind spots for all of them. All of them have let their food infrastructure go to shit. All of them, have done certain things. But we can't even get what Europe has. If you want to change that, it's not a dirty break. It's not hope. It's not hoping things are going to be better. It's not getting over a capitalist realism. It's being willing to knock down and drag out fight. And not just of the conservatives and not just of the crypto fascists you see behind the bushes. Some of them are real, by the way. No, you have to fight people who you think are your allies. We have to give up on maintaining this popular front nonsense that has cost us so much since 1936. And we have to give up trying to pretend we can do things we can't do unless we understand who our enemies are nearest us. Only then can we take the enemies further away. Good night and good luck.